Thank you for joining us today. Really excited to have you guys here, tell you a little bit about convergence, and then get into two really good knowledge sharers who are here to share with us today. So, if you haven't joined Rogue Water Lab before, just quickly want to tell you a little bit about who we are and why we put on programming like this. So, we're a nonprofit creative hub really trying to just advance trust and support for water through better engagement. So we design experiences, resources, networks that help all of you guys communicate and connect with more clarity, empathy, and impact. So we really envision a future where we have engaged and thriving communities who have trusted and resilient water and wastewater services and providers. And we know there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get us along there. So I'm Chelsea Boozer, and I'm honored to serve as the executive director of Rogue. On the back end today, managing kind of the slides and engaging with you in the chat, we have our program coordinator, Allie Dunbar. And again, we're so excited to welcome you to Convergence. So as yeah, love that, Sylvia, in the chat. As Allie puts up the slide for Convergence, really quickly want to tell you what the heck you're joining into today, because I know this is a webinar format, but really it's our first class that we're offering for free as part of our year-long master class. Because we wanted to give you kind of like a free and open taste of what we're going to be exploring in a cohort format over the next 12 months. So Convergence is designed as a place where water leaders come together to connect, upskill, and lead. And it's the only masterclass of its kind created specifically for you guys, specifically for the water sector. It's built on the idea that progress is going to happen when people from different disciplines and areas in water collaborate with purpose. So, should you choose to enroll after today, you'll be more part of a cohort taught each month by a network of national experts, practitioners teaching messaging, media and stakeholder relations, public speaking, and a lot more. So, quickly at the end, if y'all want to stick around at the end today, I'll go more into that and maybe answer any of your questions about it. But for now, we'll go ahead and put the enrollment link in the chat if you want to check it out as we move along. Today's session is actually a glimpse into what's next for Convergence. It's really meant, like I said, to give you a taste of what type of topics we're going to be diving deeper into through that instructor kind of group discussion based lessons that will start next month. And go all the way through October 2026. So, just a quick logistic for those of you who have already enrolled. You would have received an email this week about this, but I just did want to tell you, in case you're confused logging on today, that this class does look a little different. You're joined by about 200 other people today who have registered to check this out. And so while we won't do cohort introductions today and we don't have that intimate kind of setting, we will going forward. We'll look forward to doing that in our December class. And when enrollment ends on December 1st, you guys will receive a full packet with more information. And obviously, you know how to reach us, and we're happy to answer other questions. So let's go ahead and bring out our first knowledge sharer of today, Sarah Bushi, as Director of Strategic Communications of the Water Hub. So super excited to have Sarah. She's a communication strategist with over 15 years of experience advancing conservation, climate, clean water solutions. And her background is really in the environmental advocacy organization space, where she's fought for sound policy, and action around water source protection, clean energy. So now in her role, she helps others craft campaigns through the use of personal stories to connect an audience to a message. And that's where we'll have her talk about today. A few years ago, Sarah began tracking and reporting on how the media covers water and climate issues. So she's going to give us a little 15-minute overview of how all of our work is discussed in the press as kind of a starting point for us to start understanding what other messages are out there about our work to the same audience that we all are trying to message to. So as Sarah begins, feel free to engage in the chat. Feel free to engage in the Q&A. We're not going to pause here after her piece for a live Q&A, but she's still going to be on and engaging with you guys through chat. So feel free to do that there. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thanks for having me. So I know we're going to pull some other slides up, but just wanted to thank you for that introduction and just want to introduce my team and organization a little bit while those are coming up. So As Chelsea said, my name's Sarah. I work as the Director of Strategic Communications with the Water Hub. The Water Hub is a pretty unique organization. We are a nonprofit and we are a pro bono communications team that supports the water sector. So we do that by helping groups working on water issues across the United States with communications research, with training, with creative content, and through hands-on support. And Chelsea asked me to join today's session to walk through highlights from the Water Hub's 2024 National Media Scan, which we could kind of call this talk Weather Whiplash and Water Infrastructure in the Headlines, if we wanted to give it a snappy title. I didn't give it the snappiest title on this slide, which is just analyzing the water media landscape. But yeah, if we went quickly through, but we had some nice pictures up of our team, and I did want to share yeah, that's a little bit about what we do. And if you're interested in getting information on research reports that we put out, we also put out messaging guides. We have workshops that are open to the public. I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, The Water Cooler. So I'll just put that in the chat here. And it's mainly geared towards water communicators, but I do think anyone in the industry will find things that are useful for you. We often share what we're reading and watching and things that we have coming up. So thank you for this opportunity. If we want to go to the next slide, I wanted to share a little bit about my goal for today. So, as Chelsea mentioned, each year the Water Hub uses media monitoring software to do some keyword and text-based analysis of what water stories are getting covered and what's missing from the media conversation. So, I'm going to spend about 10-15 minutes speaking before we get into George's masterclass on persuasion. And really, my goal for this session is just to share a little bit about how water is getting framed in the media, what stories rose to the top of headlines last year, and what does that mean for water leaders like you who are trying to communicate about these complex issues in your communities, knowing that you have limited time and limited resources. So this first slide is just an aggregate and showing how many news articles there have been about water issues over the last 15 years. And obviously 2025 is not over yet, so that will probably tick up just a little bit. But we do this every year because we know that the media shapes public understanding of water issues. And so it's really important for utilities, community organizations, researchers to understand that what's getting covered, what are the topics, and what are the gaps, because the media influences public understanding, expectations, and trust. And so for our scans, we don't make distinctions and try to define water in a certain way. So we include clean water and drinking water and wastewater and stormwater. We try to be very comprehensive, but the way that we break it down to be a little more manageable in analyzing and understanding these trends is in three major buckets. So we look at news coverage around water supply issues. So this bucket is focused on how much water there is, coverage of things like flooding, drought, groundwater. We look at water safety. So you can think of this as the water quality bucket. And that includes topics both around clean water and ecosystems as well as drinking water. And then the third bucket we look at is water access and affordability. So that's coverage around actual access, outages, shutoffs, infrastructure failures, as well as issues around rates and affordability. There's definitely a bit of overlap between those categories as well. We don't try to control for that intentionally because we know that these things can't always be neatly put in just one bucket or another, but you can definitely, if you're interested in that, dig into the methodology in our report. And I'm gonna also drop a link to our last scan. So if you're interested in the news for 2025, come back and check with us early next year, and we'll have our next report up. And just a little big picture before I get into what we found in each of these topics. So water supply news, as you can see here, tends to be that biggest bucket or the most covered category. Last year, about half of all water news was looking at the water supply side of things. And I do like to look back over trends in the last decade because we can kind of see how the amount of coverage is connected to current events. So there's a bit of dip in water supply and water safety news in 2020 because the media was really focused on COVID and the pandemic, but there was a lot of focus on how access to water shutoffs, the impact of access on Navajo Nation, for example, played into public health protections around COVID. And then what we see here is then in 2021 and 2022, especially a huge spike in that water supply area. And that was largely driven by the Colorado River crisis and the impacts of drought, and the fact that in 2022 there were some of the first reductions in water deliveries in the Colorado River Basin. So that was one of the main drivers, and we're sort of seeing a kind of return to what has been a typical baseline for the last decade or so. And the big topics that really broke through that I think will be particularly interesting for water utilities last year were weather whiplash and emergencies. We really see that extreme weather and the water cycle and weather events drive coverage. Um, we know that in the water supply side of news, that drought continues to be a huge driver of media coverage, but it's not just in the West. We are also seeing that across the country in the Mississippi River Basin, for example. There have been major issues in coastal Louisiana around the threat of saltwater intrusion, and that's a top concern for water utilities in the Gulf as the Mississippi River experiences drought. We also see really interesting coverage of how it's not just drought. And the reason we kind of use that term weather whiplash is because in many places we're seeing these swings between extremes of heavy rain and then periods of drought. And so that's why we're calling that weather whiplash. So in 2024, at the same time that many parts of the US were experiencing this drought, in many of those same places also felt heavy rain and flooding in the upper Midwest and Texas and California, and these kind of swings between. So that has been a major driver. We also see aging infrastructure and continued coverage of communities facing water crises. Last year was the 10th anniversary of the Flint water crisis. There's been ongoing national media coverage of the Jackson water crisis. And then we also see federal movement around regulations and projects being a driver of coverage as well. And another thing that we notice about coverage in this kind of water supply news, and you can sort of see through this word chart, which is basically the top keywords that kind of came out in the many thousands of news articles that there were. There's a much climate change and issues around climate change show up much more heavily in stories about water supply and tend to be less of a focus as we get later on of kind of drinking water safety coverage. So we see keywords around drought and rain, climate change, fires, storms, and then a little bit of impacts on things like farmers come up, and the agricultural sector comes up quite a bit in this section. But we have kind of identified that gap and that the media tends to make these climate connections when we're talking about rivers and drought, but they more rarely make the connections between climate change and infrastructure vulnerability. So that's one place where we've sort of see a gap that could be filled. Um, some other like kind of the big picture topics and water supply news I wanted to make sure to bring up. So on that climate coverage, about 30% of stories around drought do explicitly mention climate change, but that number is still kind of relatively low, honestly, if you think about it. There were quite a lot of there is quite a growing body of coverage around groundwater depletion, particularly in the West, as well as indigenous water rights. And that significant volume of coverage particularly highlights tribal leadership and the ongoing negotiations in the Colorado River Basin and ongoing rights settlements. Um, and basically, one of the things I wanted to highlight and what it means for this audience here is when we're talking about water supply and weather whiplash, the public overwhelmingly hears about water when bad things are happening. And this is something that's going to come up throughout our scan as well, where crisis extremes really do drive the news cycle. And so most people are hearing about problems. They're hearing about, I mean, these are really big problems and challenges you all are facing, but people really are hearing about these in terms of crisis. And we see much fewer news stories that are proactively looking at smart management, planning, resilience, what folks are doing to address these crises. So that is another place where we have this opportunity and kind of a messaging gap. If we go to the next slide, we can look at our keywords around water safety. And you'll see here a big difference is there's a huge focus on drinking water and public health when it comes to our water safety news. So public health concerns drove most of the drinking water coverage, especially in 2024. There were EPA rules being finalized that drew a lot of national attention, and so there was a lot of coverage on PFAS, on the lead and copper rule, and additionally on how extreme weather exposed some of the fragility of our drinking water systems. So hurricanes Beryl and Helene, for example. And then another newer area in this water safety that we were seeing get more coverage was around cybersecurity threats. So that was something that sort of popped up that I had not seen before in a topic related to drinking water and infrastructure. Let me make sure I'm doing okay on time. We can go to the next slide on water access and affordability. So this topic was really focused on the impact of bills and people, which makes a lot of sense. And I think that one of the things we saw, that water access and affordability tends to be kind of like there's less coverage of it than the other topics. But anytime there is rate increases proposed around issues of needing to invest in our infrastructure, one of the things we see is sort of articles framed around rate heights as like utilities want to raise prices instead of we need to invest in our systems for XYZ reason. But there was also coverage of individuals facing unaffordable water bills and service shutoff risks, but we saw very limited coverage of the financial assistance. 2024 was the year that the low-income household water assistance program ended. Very few amount of coverage around those types of programs, what's available. And so that's another opportunity where we're like, this would be great to get the news out and let people know about all the different kinds of programs that exist and the fact that there actually isn't a national program around water affordability, which could be good. And so to end, I've got 4 more minutes left here. We can go to our last slide. So again, hope folks will read our report. This is something that I lead on the early part of the year for our team. but just a few conclusions and recommendations. We see that overall, climate change is really testing our water systems, extreme weather, drought, and a need for increased safety is really testing our water systems. And so there is an important opportunity for both journalists, but also community leaders and the water sector to keep telling stories in the spotlight that are not just about disasters, but about the day-to-day work to make us more prepared for extremes, to restore ecosystems, to keep water safe and affordable for everyone. And so really just want to continue to encourage more proactive storytelling, moving from just times of crisis and failure to what's going on every day to invest in protecting water infrastructure and the ability to deliver water to people. We also saw an opportunity to connect big issues to how they're being impacted in local communities and the challenges that communities are facing and addressing them and looking at those solutions. So connecting, you know, the public really understands the impacts of climate change on something like drought. It makes a lot of sense. Hotter, drier, less water, kind of get that. But there's less of an understanding on how these changes are impacting other pieces of our water infrastructure. And so there's a place where we could help to educate and inform. There's important storytelling that really is human-centered and focused on people. Some of the stories that we saw really pop in our scan are focused on individual impacts and how it's not just about pipes and concrete, but it's about how these systems work together and how it really impacts people and families. And so talking about infrastructure, not just in and of itself, not just about the process, but about greater values and greater themes around health and dignity and reliability is important. Um, and I think that's it. So as Chelsea mentioned, I can't do a Q&A live, but I'm happy to engage with folks in the chat if you want to continue the discussion, and I'll drop my email in there as well and hope you'll stay connected with the Water Hub.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I think this was so good. I'm so glad you had the conclusions and kind of tips at the end, because I think what we learned from this as well, when you first brought up the slides, I bet there was many people in the call thinking, "Oh, what do you mean it's about weather and climate change?" It's really good for us to know what is our audience thinking about. So while we might want them to think about infrastructure and funding, we do need to connect it to the topics they're already thinking about. So thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate having you here. For everyone, I know that was not long enough to go into that topic. So, again, it was just a taste, and it was an example of, again, what we'll be diving deeper into in Convergence. When you think about messaging to your audience, what does that look like? How do we stop ourselves when we're storytelling to make sure that we're doing that? And so, before I bring up a next speaker, Ali, you can go ahead and go to the slide with his LinkedIn so people can connect with him as I chat. But we're really now going to segue into and have our first class by our first practitioner and hear about persuasion. And this is to represent the messaging piece of the Convergence Masterclass. So you might be thinking, who is Convergence for? What if I don't have a communications title in my role? What if I don't work with the media and don't message outwardly? One, you're wrong. You do message outwardly. Everyone does that. And so George's talk, I'm super excited about, is really to showcase for us that convergence is for all of us. So whether you need help connecting and speaking to your boss, to your clients, to your customers, to the community, to policymakers, you can plug and play your audience. So we will be talking about media and broadly messaging in different ways in convergence. So if you have any questions afterwards about is it for you, let me know. But I think George is going to solve some of that for us. So as George comes on, sometimes I think George needs no introduction. Many people know of George. So he previously he's now the founder and CEO of Moonshot Missions. Previously, he was the general manager of DC Water. During his 11-year tenure there, he helped transform that utility into an innovative, customer-driven enterprise. He tripled the investment in clean water. So he went on to create Moonshot Missions, which is a nonprofit that's sending utility advisors out to assess and conditions and help propose and create efficient utility solutions and solve these challenges for systems and communities across the U.S. today, George is here to draw on from over 6,000 public meetings he's participated in, many I bet he wishes he didn't have to be at, across his 38-year career. And he's going to share with us proven and practical strategies to build trust, diffuse tension, and inspire action, even when the crowd starts out against you, which I know we've all been there. So let me welcome George. Welcome.
Thank you, Chelsea. I was walking down the hall in DC's administration municipal building. It's a Beaux Arts classic. It's marble and granite with 15-foot ceilings. And I was walking next to the very powerful city administrator at the time. This was in 2009. And I got pulled by him into a stairwell that I didn't even know was there, but it was this old fashioned, this was built 1905. So before elevators, this was the way everyone got up and down. It was a big, wide stairwell with high, no one was in it. It was empty. And so everything that we were saying was sort of echoing up and down these stairs. And I remember thinking to myself, oh gosh, when you get called into a stairwell in City Hall, that's generally not a good thing. So I was nervous even to start the conversation. Dan was my boss, and probably the most powerful person in the city other than the mayor. And he turned to me and said, the mayor has something he wants you to do. And I said, okay, I've been serving the mayor for several years now. I'm pleased to do whatever is needed. He goes, he would like you to apply to become general manager of DC Water. At the time, it was DC WASA. I was on the board of DC WASA. I was the director of the District Department of Energy and Environment, which is a regulatory agency. I'm a lawyer by training, and I regulated DC WASA. I didn't like them. They didn't like me. We battled all the time over various permits and everything else. And here, the mayor wanted me to apply to become general manager. He could not appoint me because DC WASA is an authority, so it's an independent entity. I went back that day and went home and was depressed and panicked of what was I going to do in this situation. Ratchet forward, another image. I'm standing in the parking lot of the Bryant Street pump station. Again, this is an old, beautiful building in DC, built between 1905 and 1910. And I was being introduced. I had, in fact, been selected as the new GM of DC Water. I was wearing a dark suit like I wore every day in my old job as a regulator and a lawyer in the parking lot of a pump station that I'd never been to before. So this was the first time I'd ever seen the Bryant Street pump station, a beautiful, huge building. But it looks like the cross between a beautiful public building and almost like a prison because it's a protected building. It has high fencing all around it with cameras on the corners because the drinking water supply of much of the city, including the Capitol and that part of Washington, D.C., came through this pump station. So it was you had to go through a guard booth with armed police officers in order to get to this press conference where I was being announced. So on one side of the parking lot where this little podium had been set up where they're announcing me as the new CEO, and there was a lot of media there, tremendous curiosity at what was going to happen at DC WASA. As some of you may know, the worst lead in water crisis in the United States prior to Flint was in DC. And above the fold, as they used to say when people bought paper newspapers, DC WASA was constantly in the press, and it was all negative. The charges were that DC WASA had poisoned the city, the DC WASA had hidden the consequence. There were all sorts of really terrible stories about DC WASA, including a customer survey that ranked DC WASA as the worst customer service agency in the city. That was of all of them, including the IRS and all these others. And it takes effort to be worst at something in the same way it takes effort to be best at something. And there I was being introduced, having very little sense of how the job, but the fascinating question to me was, as I sat at the podium with the media and other dignitaries, the mayor and the powerful chair of the board of the directors of DC WASA on one side, and we had Chief Administrative Officer, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and DC. So all the districts across state boundaries. There's no other authority in the country that does that. All here at this, but across the parking lot on the other side was a large number of DC WASAs at the time, employees. And standing in front of trucks, because it turns out, I didn't know this, Bryan Street is where all the drinking water services of DC WASA were deployed in the city. So if there was a water main break, if there was a problem, that would roll out of Bryan Street. So there were a lot of employees based there. And the attribute to me is almost all were employees that were dressed in working uniforms. I mean, overall safety gear, very unlike a regulatory agency and the suit I was wearing. And it was also almost all African American. Most of the employees at DC WASA then and now were African American folks from the entire region. And here they were staring across the parking lot at this new person who was coming from a regulatory agency and Caucasian male of a certain age and wearing a suit. So that's the second image. The third image I want you to have in your mind is maybe a month and a half later. I'm sitting in the office now at Blue Plains, the huge treatment plant in Washington, D.C., meeting with our CFO. And he had come in to tell me about the budget for the following year. So I was hired at the end of 2009. This was for the budget of 2010. And he was projecting an 18 to 21% rate increase my first year. That was my welcome to DC WASA, was this mammoth rate increase, because we had a capital budget that was designed, which was planned, and we planned out 10 years each year to go up almost $100 million a year for several years in a row. So the capital budget was going up like a rocket ship, and all that money had to be raised. There was a new impervious area charge that was being put in for the first year, in my first year. All these things were happening. And I remember sitting in the office then thinking, oh my God, what have I done? I had 3 panics in a row. One panic of, would I do this at all? Second panic is, do I have any connection to the people who are in this kind of work? I don't really understand it. And third is, oh my gosh, I've got to present to ratepayers these mammoth increases to an organization that was the worst customer service rated enterprise at the time in the city. Now, why do I mention those 3 stories? Because the commonality between what happened next was all about persuasion, and persuasion at 3 levels that are relevant to all of us. One is what we persuade ourselves of. That happens all the time. We've got to ourselves learn, think, evolve, and change of how we are perceiving our life, our careers, all sorts of things. And how do we work with ourselves to adapt and change our mindset? That was that first thing. Was I even able to get around the idea of applying to become GM of DC WASA, a place I didn't like and regulated? The second was a persuasion need between myself and my colleagues, when at least at the onset, we were completely coming from different places. I'd never worked in a utility. I really didn't know a lot about what the utility did, I'm sorry to say. I knew all their permits, I knew the consent decree, but I didn't know. And here, vast number of people working out all over the city were doing things and how was I going to communicate with this new different group of people who I'm now a participant in? And I'm not just I'm supposed to be the chief. And then the third was, oh my gosh, I've got to communicate the value and the need of what we're doing to a populace who either doesn't know us at all. You turn on the water and where does it come from? Heck if I know. When I flush the toilet, where does it go? Heck if I know. Or if they did know DC WASA, by and large, it was pretty negative. It was bad customer service. It was lead crisis, poisoning children. It was all of that. And that, like I said, it was both TV news and above the fold. So in each case, what I discovered is that lessons I had learned in thousands of meetings, I used to go to many a week, every week, when I was doing community-based water work in New Jersey and then all these various jobs I've had, is I used the same techniques to persuade whatever the audience was, whether it was me, whether it was my team, or whether it was the public. And then various other assorted stakeholders we all have, like DC Council, who I had hearings with every year. We had our budget approved by Congress, so I had in front of Congress, which is sort of unique because of DC, and all the other public meetings I did as a DC rep, because I felt if you had questions for the leader, I should go meet you in person. So what techniques am I talking about? And the thing about persuasion is, to me, it's the issue that should be front and center in almost every conversation you have. One of my things that I always hear that makes me fearful is when someone says, well, I expressed myself or I expressed my feelings. And that is something that it's important to do in certain audiences, particularly with family or loved ones or otherwise. But when you're in a professional setting, unless those feelings are deployed in service of persuasion, I'm showing what I feel because it gets me towards an end that I seek. It's not about what I feel. Unless it's helpful to the cause, I'm always oriented towards doing everything I can to enable this persuasion relationship. So and by the way, persuasion broadly defined. Are you selling a product or service? You're part of a company and you're selling some technology well, you have to persuade someone to buy it. Are you presenting a program inside your enterprise? You'd like to see it expand. You need more resources. So you're trying to persuade whomever, the budget people, your own program directors, of what you're doing. Are you doing a planned action where you're presenting to the public? We like to go this, we'd like to do that. We want you to understand what we're doing and why. Or are you in the public and you're trying to give a response, or in any of these meetings with an alternative? Well, I hear what you're saying, but how about this? In all of these, or you're seeking a job. I'm presenting myself to someone who has control over, in part, my career. How do I present? All of that is about persuasion. Now, what I'm not going to talk about today is the content of your presentations. I have rarely seen presentations that fail on content. And if they do, it's usually a deep failure. If you're in front of an audience and don't know what you're talking about on sort of she used the phrase IQ versus EQ, the IQ of a presentation. If you don't have good content and sort of know your field, you're going to fail no matter what else happens. But I'm presuming, and I usually see presenters who have that down well. I'm going to more talk about I'm sorry to use such sort of popular phrases, but the EQ of the presentation. What have I done to make sure that the way and manner in which I present is most likely, or gives me the best chance of persuading or accessing an audience that's willing to listen? So here is, by the way, I do have a curriculum on persuasion. It's 6 pages worth. I love being part of what Chelsea is doing with Convergence and Catalyst and all of the services of Rogue Water. I've been affiliated off and on with Rogue Water, I think, since the very first Catalyst was hosted many years ago. But I love what they're doing. Chelsea is a water person. I don't know if you know this about her. She worked for Central Arkansas Water, which is the largest water utility in her state, and spent over 5 years doing exactly what we're talking about, both rate increases, finding new financial, talking to customers about service, including service disruptions. So she is building an enterprise that is with and for us, designed with us in mind and with our kind of issues. And she's calling them some of the very best in the business. I see it's Vince Morris and Christy Harosky and Mike McGill. A lot of people I highly respect are part of these programs. So I absolutely recommend you join Convergence, or when Catalyst comes up. Chelsea, you didn't mention that, but that comes up sometime next year. That's a beautiful program as well. But Rogue Water is awesome. So if you can participate, I highly encourage it. And if you sign up for the Convergence series, you'll get my curriculum as part of the program. So you'll get the 6 pages of the outline, everything I'm about to say, you will see in an outline. If you want to remind yourself or do a quick add to it, it's never exhaustive. This is what I've learned by doing. I have no corner on wisdom, but there's a lot of meetings I've gone to where I've tried to encapsulate what's worked for me. The other way you can get the curriculum from me is if you reach out to me on LinkedIn. George Hawkins, I'm relatively easy to find. You reach out to me, I have an advantage of then knowing you and connecting with you on LinkedIn, vice versa, and then I will shoot you the Persuasion curriculum as an attachment to a message or to your email. So either way, I'd love to follow. So persuasion. When we think about persuading an audience, the fundamental question is, how well do you know the audience, and in what manner can you build a relationship with them, even if they're somewhat hostile or in conflict? And there's some practical steps that you can go through that I have found really work. And I'll just start going through some of them. And by the way, these steps that you go through is learning about your audience will only benefit you. To the degree an audience understands that you know something about them, you've done your homework, you've shown an interest in them, no matter what your message is. I'm here for a reason. Even before I get there, I'm going to say things or acknowledge that I've learned about you. I respect you. I respect what you do, even if you disagree with me. I've learned about your enterprise or where you come from. And that people like that. They respect the fact that you respected them. By the way, Moonshot, which works with utilities, mainly those with less resources, always go, we call it humble listening. No matter how much knowledge our team has, and they have a lot, way more than I do, for example, on how to run water utilities, we don't go in being smarty pants. We go in knowing the kind of questions to ask, but then always listening and learning about the place we are engaging with before we suggest anything. But I do recommend that when you start a presentation of whatever sort, if you're giving you do start with a story. That's what I did starting here. And I do that on purpose. When I'm speaking to an audience and can start with some sort of story, there's a period of time at the beginning of a presentation where people are just settling in. They need a chance to sort of settle down. What have they been doing before to put their phone down, to sort of clue in to the speaker before you start highlighting the key points you want to make, because they may not be ready for the key points when you first start speaking. But if you start with a story, and I didn't usually start, it's the first time I've ever used those three little stories today, but usually I tell a story about a water main break or a sewer overflow. So I make a connection with the audience. It shows the challenges we faced at DC Water and then start on the practice of, well, here's what we did to overcome. It allows folks to sort of calm, focus, and learn about you and have a sense of you as a person before they're being asked to understand some issue that you're presenting to them. So I love starting with a story. Personally, I don't use jokes. If you can do it and it's natural to you, then by all means. Some of the stories I tell have a lot of things that are in it that are funny, because a lot of funny things have happened to me. But the story is funny, not me. I don't consider myself a funny person, but I do have funny stories because our sector has so many of those. So second, what do I do when I'm making a presentation to help make a connection to the audience? And here's some practical issues. And not all of these will be relevant, particularly in a virtual setting. But if you're visiting a place in person, they are often relevant. One is I try to find out about where I'm speaking. I was asked to speak in Albany, New York at some point. I think it was to the New York Water Environment Association, and a big contingent from Albany had invited me. And I learned about the building we were doing the presentation in. It was a very interesting building. And I mentioned that to start. I can't remember how the story, and I was talking about the building, and I could tell that the folks from Albany already were positive and like smiles on their faces because I was showing and I knew something about their city or their state. Everybody likes to hear about themselves in a positive way, even if it's just briefly. A, it shows you respect and you listened and learned first. But second, who doesn't like? I'm from Cleveland. I hate when someone starts talking about Cleveland and the first thing they say are all the negative things. Someone can come in Cleveland and say, "Oh my gosh, you've got this, you've got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I can't wait to go visit." You realize I didn't know that something positive about a place rather than ranking on it, and your audience is going to be interested in, or at least warming up to you. Second, do you know about your audience, and can you do research on that? Most audiences you probably can. Who's likely to show up? Where are they coming from? What are their interests? Are there particular issues that we can highlight or that I can emphasize in the story I pick? Well, this is an issue. I remember I did a presentation out in the West, and it was at the Water Smart conference. So it was very much drinking water and water conservation. So I picked a particular story that demonstrated how bad DC Water was with a lot of drinking water issues. We had 450 water main breaks. That's not drinking water, but that's lost wastewater, it's drinking water, lost drinking water systems and all. And I could tell the people in the crowd resonated with a drinking water story, because then I started telling about some of the things that changed as a result. So you can mention, and this is even true of audiences who are hostile. I had two very hostile meetings early in my tenure at DC Water. One was with lead advocates. they were really angry with DC WASA and the way the lead issue had been handled. And they came into our conference room, the whole group of them, they were angry and pounding on the table. And I had done some research on them. And when I first started speaking, I said, look, I think what you do is wonderful. You are concerned about the public health and welfare of the people of the city from lead. So am I. So will this organization be. I like that you've done this. I like that you've recommended ways to improve our drinking water. And we looked at them, and the meeting switched immediately from just being mad and sort of this confrontation to, so can you walk me through these changes you recommend to our lead in water testing program? Won't go into the details, but we were not doing it right at DC WASA, and their recommendations are actually good ones. And so by getting to know the audience and getting to know what their interests were, and this is one of the most important lessons I have learned in my career, is when I take this step, it's not only that I say things aware of what the audience is interested in, it changes me. When I learn about something, gosh, they have a good point. We are using a narrow bottled water top to do the lead water testing, which means you can't turn the water on very strong because it'll splash off the water. And their view was by turning it on less strong, not the way you'd use it in the morning or in a shower, you weren't getting an accurate test of what actually was likely to come out. We also were telling our testing to turn the water on and wait 2 minutes. So that means all the water that was sitting in the pipe, which is the water your kids are going to brush their teeth with, had already flowed through, and maybe you were getting cleaner water that was out in the system. That didn't seem right. But as we were talking and learning, like, they're right. And that happens to me all the time. Even I come in, I'm certain I've got a point, I'm going to deliver it, and is what it is. And then I start investigating other points of view and who's in the audience, including people who disagree. Doesn't mean I agree with everything by any means, but it almost always means there are elements of what they're saying that make sense to me. And I can now add, so persuasion, the key to persuasion actually, when it works at its best, is it goes both ways. I'm not just persuading the audience, is by getting to know the audience, they are persuading me even before they know it. So that if I can accommodate, I can evaluate, I can mention some of their interests and how we are thinking of it, and then ask them, tell me more. That shifts this confrontational conversation into where can we find common ground? And it's not that we're going to do everything that you seek or that you will agree with everything we do, but we can find a common ground. And I'll tell you the most dramatic version of that was at rate hearings that I used to give, and I'll come back to those. I had 1 year, I did all the rate hearings myself all over the city. A group stood up, they were all a certain color shirt. It was an advocacy program that is based on a system that was developed in Chicago, I can't remember the name, and they attack the public official. And I didn't know this. They'd had a meeting beforehand that I couldn't make it to, and they put a picture of me up in the front of this packed room and all yelled at it. Was the precursor. I didn't realize any of this. I come into this next meeting, and they came to our rate hearing. They took over the meeting, marched up to the front of the stage, grabbed the microphone away from one of my staff members. I mean, this had the look of, oh my gosh, this is going to be, police are going to be involved. There's going to be fisticuffs. My team was ready to sort of go at it. No one likes having someone come up and sort of just take over the meeting. And I remember I said, hold on. I'm not familiar with your enterprise. Can you tell me what you're mad about? And in a very angry voice at first, it turned out as I was listening is what this group wanted, because we have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, blue collar workforce in the region, was for DC to hire more people who needed jobs from the district and surrounding areas. So I was like, why are we fighting? That is something we're interested in doing. So we diffused it. I let their person talk. I said, how about your group come in and meet with me next week? And I would like to hear, we are trying to do better workforce work. We've not done very well with this in the past. So how would you suggest we improve our workforce program? And almost immediately that changed the conversation. And in fact, we did it to change our workforce program based on some of their recommendations. It's called DC Waterworks. And in the following next program, which was in a huge church packed full of people, the speaker who had stood up and was yelling at me, and myself, with the mayor in the crowd, we talked about what we were doing together on Workforce, and we got off the podium and got into a kayak together to be an emblem that we were working together for the future of the city, which sort of was but that was just by learning about what their interests were. So pay attention. Third, so first, you know where you are. Can you mention something about the place? People will like to hear it. Second, do you know the audience? Can you learn from them and maybe incorporate some of their ideas into what you're saying? And third, this is very practical. Who's your host? Who are they? What's their name? Say something about them. Any host will want to have you come back if they are hosting you, if you mention it. And it doesn't necessarily mean like I would have done this anyways, but notice as soon as I was talking, I haven't even introduced myself. George. I introduced Chelsea. I said something good about her because she deserves it. I said something good about Rogue because it deserves it. I said something about convergence that a host of a meeting will always like. And they'll have a good feeling about you as a speaker, about your message, about maybe bringing you back. All those things happen. If you think about how can I make sure that the person who's sponsoring me gets something from my presentation on their terms, not just mine. They're not just going to hear about what I have to say. I'm going to say something about the organization sponsoring me. And that's almost always a fascinating question. So those are 3 steps that you can take to prepare yourself. When I speak, I don't speak from notes, but what I do is I have a 3x5 card, and I have 1 or 2 facts in each of those categories listed on the card, just to make sure I remember. That's about all, because a lot of the rest of this presentation, I know what I'm going to say, but I have what are the quick things that I can say to make sure I'm readying the audience. So if you prepared this as part of your presentation and you're now ready, so I think doing the story, knowing the place, knowing the audience, knowing your sponsors, all those things are getting the audience ready, willing, and able to at least hear and listen to what you have to say. So then you start to speak. And I will spend just a moment on presentation IQ, which is the content of a presentation, because what you know about the audience should change what you present. I'll give you one quick example, and this was on a product sale. We had created something called a tag, which is something IL Utilities does. And we had all of the big water utilities in the DC region. We had Fairfax Water, WSSC, DC Water, Loudoun Water in a room. And according to something we were interested in, we had technology providers coming and making presentation about their technologies to us. I bet there was several $billion of buying power. Priceless opportunity for these companies. Yet when most of the people came in to present, they presented their standard PowerPoint that looked to me like it was designed for a maintenance manager. By the way, I love maintenance managers. This is not a criticism of a maintenance manager. That's just not who was in the room. We were CFOs, CEOs, chief engineers, and it was these presentations that were very complicated with curves and charts and graphs and numbers. And at the end, this is one in particular I remember, there was case studies of how this technology had helped water utilities. And by the time most of these presentations got to that point, they had lost the room. I was looking around, and these are busy people. They were looking at their phone, doing other things, because what was being presented wasn't relevant to a CFO. And I talked to one of the presenters afterwards. I said, you should flip that slide deck exactly upside down. Start with several case studies. Here's what we did in Cedar Rapids. Here's what happened. Here's some of the financial outcomes and operational outcomes. I'll tell you another story so that the audience hears and sees issues at what they do every day in their job. Gosh, I'd like to save some money and improve performance. And it happened in another utility, which I could check. You could tell me the details, but I'll refer you to our chief of maintenance to get all the details, but you've got my interest because you're speaking my language. So that means your presentation IQ should be oriented towards emphasizing the topics that are relevant to the audience for whom you're standing in front of. Now, for the presentation itself, another thing I've often seen, which sort of I find remarkable, is sometimes I see a presentation where it seems like this is the first time the person's ever really delivered it. Because they're smart, by the way, very strong attribute, because they're experts, they spend all their time putting the presentation together. What slides, what the numbers, even if they've reoriented the slides to their audience, all that, it's the presentation has been the focus. But when they deliver it, it's sort of halting and they're going back and forth and hemming and hawing and sort of figuring out almost as they're going along about how verbally to present. That would be like starring in a Broadway show and having the first time you sang the songs as standing in front of the audience. Professionals in sports and all the other performance arts practice all the time behind the scenes so that when they are in front of an audience or a crowd or whatever, that they practice whatever they're doing. So it looks easy, but the only reason it looks easy is because they did it 10,000 times. Now, I'm not saying you should do a practice presentation 10,000 times, but it will benefit you so much to deliver the presentation to yourself. I used to do this all the time. My kids would make fun of me as I would drive them around because I was always talking to myself. And they were always like, who are you talking to? You sound like a crazy person. And what I was doing was talking it through presentations that I knew were coming up. Because what I wanted was when I was in front of a crowd, I was not looking at slides. I was not looking at my notes. I was talking about things that almost seemed like I was having a conversation, but it was like a good basketball player making a shot look easy. That wasn't because I was actually just making things up. It's because I had practiced the words. I had a sense of how they fit together and how sentences go one after the other. And practicing makes so much difference. Time frame. I have 5 minutes to testify in front of Congress. That's it. So I have to practice with a 5-minute clock under battle conditions. If you're going into a conflict meeting with a audience that's skeptical, what I used to do and still do when I can, at DC Water, we call it murderer's row. I'm not sure why we came up with that phrase, but I had all of my chief team arrayed in a conference room. I would have my presentation. They would know what I was speaking about in advance. I'd give the presentation again under time. It seemed sort of pressured because all these people were staring. So it's really to give muscle memory of this moment. And then I asked them, ask the hardest questions you possibly can for the next 2 hours. Just drill me on everything and anything you could possibly think of that someone might ask when I'm in front of this audience. And what happened I loved it, by the way. I always loved that kind of exchange, but I was, again, sampling answers because this is our own. Well, gosh, that didn't really work. I should try something different. We went back and forth and back and forth. By the time the hearing came, it almost seemed like, gosh, this is fun and easy. Questions came up I'd anticipated because the team had already asked me. It's amazing how much those elements can be helpful. So you're going to practice. You're going to use a story. You're going to orient your key points to the audience. And by the way, don't be shy about emphasizing the points you want to make. Here's the key point I'm going to make. Here's how I'm going to make it right up front, rather than going through the sort of writing an old-fashioned essay where you make all your points and then there's a big conclusion. You don't know whether they're going to be listening at the big conclusion unless you've caught them. But if you tell them the big conclusion, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm here, here's what the message is, I'm going to come back and go through these things, then they know what the point is. Practicing deliver. Now, here's some points, and then I'm going to turn to see if there's any questions. Some of the things that you can do before, during, and after the presentation that are different from the presentation itself. And the first thing is, what do you wear? Now, some people will not like this comment, so I'm just going to make it. And like I say, anything I say, if it speaks to you, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. It's just what's worked for me. And to me, what I wear in a business sense is a tool to an end. It's not an end in itself. A lot of people wear clothes because it's personal to them. And God bless you, I have no issue with that. But at least for me, in a job, I'm wearing what I think I need to wear in order to advance whatever I'm seeking to do. And that changeover between a DDOE, the District Department of Energy and Environment, that's the agency I ran prior to DC WASA. I was the chief lawyer. It was the first, was a new agency. It hadn't existed. So I was the first director of a new agency. And I felt, and it was a regulatory agency. We would be issuing permits and all this formal work that I ought to be in a formal suit every day because the people in the agency I felt needed the confidence. We are a professional regulatory agency. We know what we're doing and how we're doing it. And we want to relay that confidence to all the people we serve. So every single day I wore a suit as the head of the District Department of Energy and Environment. That's what I was wearing in that parking lot. When I was standing in front of it, I realized this doesn't fit at all. I'm wearing a suit to a audience that is now completely different, and they need to have a connection with me. And here's where serendipity does matter, but if you're paying attention, I didn't know that DC WASA had a uniform shop, but all of our 5 unions had uniform requirements, and there was a uniform shop that produced uniforms for the. And an older woman who ran the uniform shop came into me one day. I had an open door policy, and brought me a uniform of DC Water as a gift, never thinking I'd actually wear it. And on a whim, I wore it, and it caused sensations in the enterprise, because it indicated that at least the sense I got is that people thought, gosh, the GM is wearing the same kind of shirt we wear. This is someone who's going to be interested in what we're doing. And it was a sensation. And it wasn't my idea. It just, when I did it, I recognized that it was helping to open doors. That paired with this notion of, I didn't come into DC WASA to tell everybody what to do. I listened for the first 6 months. We didn't change anything. I met with everyone in the enterprise wearing my shirt, hearing their thoughts about things that could be done. Most of them had never spoken to a GM before. Most of them had never been asked what was on their mind. And I was changing. I was amazed. I took page after page after page, handwritten notes in the old days, of how all this was. And when we started creating our change agenda, listening to the audience, hearing, it started with all these things I heard. Language, words, values, all came to the forefront, but it was related to change. But the team at DC Water, I believe anyways, didn't feel like change was coming at them or to them. That's what often happens with change. It was with them and for them. It was coming from someone wearing a uniform just like they wore, asking questions in meetings, and then producing these change agendas that had their ideas and their words in it. There were some other things too, but it was a collection of things we did together, and it really took off once we started there. So that's one thing to do. Second, of things that you can do is think about your greeting an audience when they're coming in. I used to do rate hearings. This is worthy of a momentary aside. So some of the hardest meetings I had to do was raise rates. We tripled rates during the years I was at DC Water. Went from about $40 a month to $120 a month. And every single rate increase we asked for, we had approved unanimously. And nobody thought we could do that. What happened? In the old days, rate hearings that were required under the administrative code were 2. And they were down at this administration building behind Union Station in DC that no one could find, including me, by the way. So no one would show up. But after you had those 2 hearings, you were allowed, if the board approved, to raise rates. But that meant for most of the people in the city, they never knew there was a rate increase coming until the actual bill arrived, because they hadn't gone to any meetings. They hadn't heard anything. They had no idea. And when people say, well, there's a survey that says people don't want to raise rates for water, I'm like, of course they don't. Who is going to answer a survey asking if they want to pay more for something unless they know why? Unless there's a value in that conversation that they understand. And if they have no relationship with whomever's asking, the answer is going to be no. So that first year, and I give Alan Heyman, for those of you who know him, a lot of credit for helping to redesign, we still did those 2 required administrative hearings at the end of the process. What we did instead is we did a public meeting in every ward of the city in a place selected by the council member from that ward. It was schools and churches and rec centers. It was places that were local to that area of the city, and we invited everybody. Anybody who contacted us, by the way, most people contact a water utility to say everything's great. These were a lot of folks who were mad at us. And we invited them to come talk to me. You're going to meet the CEO. He's going to stand in front of you, make a presentation, and take all questions. And in that room, the rec center or the church or whatever it was, around the edges, we had every office of DC Water. We had the water quality group. We had the procurement group. We had this employment group. We had the capital group. So that if you had a question that you asked me and I couldn't answer, I would point you to, that's something the water quality team, they'll answer you tonight or within 24 hours. And that mechanism of doing outreach changed the whole dynamic in the city. No longer was DC Wassa this poor customer service operation that nobody knew. These were folks coming to our neighborhood. I get to talk to the CEO. I've never talked to the CEO of Verizon or any of these other. I'm talking, and they're presenting and then answering questions with their team. And by the way, they're pretty nice people. It sort of changed everything about how we made that presentation. And important to me in those meetings is I stood out in front. And so as people came in, I'd smile and say hello. I didn't want the first time they heard of me or from me was when I was talking about rates. I wanted them to have a sense I'm a nice guy. I think I am, but I was certainly being a nice person, friendly, smiling. So if they had some issue, I'd hear about it up front. So I, again, knew a sense of who was in the audience and what they were likely to say. Second is, while you're doing that, think about your facial expressions. I had a very successful, a very capable employee who I learned later, after I asked, their resting face when they were listening to a new idea was a frown. And I thought that meant they were opposed to all the things we were trying to do. So it sort of created this tension off the bat. And when I talked to her, turns out it wasn't that way at all. It's just that's how she tended to, she was being serious. I'm really listening, but it looked like she was negative. And I've always thought about that. How can I make sure my facial expression doesn't turn off anyone in the audience, even if they're mad, or be friendly, have an open variety of facial expressions you can use. Even when someone's mad, this has happened, I've gotten this bill, I can't pay, not to be defensive. I would always try to walk towards someone slowly, not threateningly, with an open, like, we can help you, let's figure this out. And that completely changed the dynamics. And the old-fashioned word that you repeat back a question that you've heard. I know that in part is so you can think of what your answer is going to be. But if you can repeat it back and show that you heard what the person said. This was something my father taught me as a lawyer when I was a kid. I didn't know this around the dinner table. We'd watch the news every night. Sort of had an eccentric father, and we would debate the news. And no matter what point of view we would take at the table, he would make us switch sides and take the other side just to see if we could. And how would you argue the other point of view? And I always felt, gosh, when I'm repeating it back, see if I can repeat it back as if I were 100% supportive or in favor of what I just heard. So I'm not just repeating back word for word what they said. I show an understanding of what they've said and why it matters. That doesn't mean I'm going to agree with it all, but again, the person who has come at you is now going to be thinking, wow, that person really heard me and understands what my issue is, which, by the way, is a huge part of a challenge in most cases, is that people don't feel like they've been heard. Something has happened to them, and they just don't feel like anyone cares. And it doesn't solve every problem, obviously, but that change in the relationship, because you demonstrated that you've heard them, and you start thinking about, well, let's see how changes a lot. I would tell you lots of stories about how what I heard in these rate hearings changed things we did, changed our rate structure for what I heard from some of our older ratepayers in these hearings. But the transformation of the public's perception of us, which was a part of a lot of these things, but particularly these meetings. We're out there, we're talking, we're you, look at the nice people, we're here to serve you. Customer service changed, perception of us changed, and like I said, all those rate increases were approved unanimously by a board that I think would never have done that without that kind of public understanding and support. Last but not least, and then I will make sure there's time for any questions that you might have, is don't be shy about networking and benefiting from these relationships you've now carefully cultivated. Because the other part of persuasion is it's not a moment. It's a pathway. So I didn't come to agreement with that group that was so mad about workforce development in the first meeting, because we were still figuring out what their point of view was, what our point of view. But what we did come away with is we want DC Water, we were now DC Water, wants to have a good workforce program. We're hearing your ideas. And the next meetings were now no longer expression of anger. You're not doing all that. that what had started with me as a picture at the front of a room with them throwing stuff at it was now, these are engagement meetings where we are working towards an end where we can be supportive of a path forward. So the persuasion is not a moment, it is a pathway. And like I said, it works both ways. They became persuaded we were a completely different organization than they thought we were. And we became persuaded that our workforce program needed some updates. And they weren't expensive. It was actually, there was, I can't remember now, 47 workforce development programs in the greater metropolitan area that were preparing people. And we weren't employing, so we are now hiring people. So our workforce program was, we're going to identify every position that's going to open on us or a contractor. And we're going to let these 47 workforce preparation enterprises know about the positions before they're hired as far in advance as possible so that they can start preparing candidates. And then we gave those organizations 3 days to apply to positions before it was open to the public, to sort of give a head start on some of the folks, particularly from the district, who needed work. And it worked beautifully, worked far better, and it never would have happened without that pathway. But what the last part, so when I said I would send you this curriculum, and like I said, all of the stuff I've said, plus some other hopefully interesting information is in this curriculum, you'll get if you sign up for the fantastic Convergence program. I mean that genuinely. It's an amazing program by water people, for water people. But second is if you send me a LinkedIn. Why do I do that? Because I want to be connected with you. I want to expand my network that allows me to do what I'm doing better. It will, I hope, help your network. It always is good to be connected to others. And then I'll shoot you the persuasion curriculum in case it can be helpful. But I make that specific as part of the presentation, not an afterthought. How do I make sure I take advantage of this relationship I hope to have built with the audience? So I'm now closer to the end than the beginning of the persuasion curriculum. I think the key points, and you heard it already from Chelsea even before I started, is the degree to which you know, understand, and are prepared for an audience will have enormous consequence to the likelihood of your success in persuading. And to me, and I'm not, this is amateur psychology at its highest. I'm no expert. I just have learned that when I take these steps and take the time, it's not just me persuading the audience, even before they know, before I know them, because as I'm doing my research, I thought DC Wasa was a terrible place. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to do the job. I didn't want any of it. And as I started doing my audience, I started reading, I was like, oh my gosh, I, as a lawyer, thought of DC Wasa as a polluter, because it's discharging all of this 270 million, 300, whatever, huge hundreds of millions of gallons of wastewater flow into the Potomac and then the Chesapeake Bay. And the mindset of a lawyer is you impose obligations on a polluter. And I didn't want to work for a polluter. But then I thought, well, wait, as I got to know DC Wasa and more of its, well, the water's coming off the Potomac, it's treated, it's sent out to everybody in this city, the capital city of the country. We take it back after it's been used and we clean it on everybody's behalf. Not a polluter. We're the public service cleaning everybody else's pollutants on their behalf so that the Potomac, and that completely changed my mindset literally overnight. I'm like, oh my gosh, DC Wasa is not a polluter. They're the most important environmental organization in Washington, D.C. Every environmental organization has an office here because of what they do for the Chesapeake, the largest freshwater. I just started persuading myself by learning about DC Wasa that this would be a wonderful opportunity. And I've never looked back. Last thing I'll say is moonshot. I left DC Water because I found that a lot of the changes that we were able to do at DC Water were largely inaccessible to water utilities with less resources. It's not because they aren't smart people. They're incredibly smart, incredibly hardworking, multitasking. They just don't have the time, the capacity, and sometimes the finances to adopt a lot of these strategies that not only deliver better performance. To me, the key was at DC Water, not just better performance, I want a better balance sheet. What are the things we can do that will reduce our costs so that we permanently have more funds to do all the rest? That means thinking in a certain way and adopting new technologies in a way that's with the staff. And that's what Moonshot seeks to do with utilities all over the country. We've been in almost 250 communities in 38 states, 12 tribal reservations, and 2 territories of every size, from the largest to the very smallest. I've got a great team of utility personnel with over 600 years of experience drinking water, wastewater, and we are humble. They are excellent. I'm not me. I'm, like I said, I'm not the expert in how to solve these things. But it's a humble group. We love to help. So if you know of any organizations and wherever you are, including your own, that could use a nonprofit trusted advisor, we sell nothing but experience that we know works. Moonshot sort of has adopted these persuasion techniques as the manner in which we do our work. And by the way, it works beautifully. Let's see. I'm looking at the questions now. So when presenting, do you ever change how you plan to deliver your content? Yes. That meeting where someone came to the front and yanked the microphone out of the hand of my staff who was about to turn it over to me. Typically in all of our rate hearings, I always divided the presentation into 4 parts. One was I wanted to prove to the audience that we were more efficient than last year. I didn't feel like I could ask them for more money unless I could prove we're better at our job. So when it cost us less to treat a gallon of water, it cost us less to replace a fire hydrant. What are the things we had done in the prior year that meant your money's going farther? 2, we do need more money, and here's the value proposition for what we seek to do. So first was efficiency, second was purpose of new funds. By the way, in our capital budget, we tried to always make sure that every neighborhood in the city benefited from our capital program. So we could talk about how capital funds, yes, solving CSO issues and all the rest. But you know that flooding down at Beach Drive in your neighborhood? We're going to solve that. So that people had a sense that some of this money was going to a problem in where they lived. Third, I would show an actual bill. So we're not hiding anything. This is what your average bill looks like now, and here's how it will look if these changes go into effect. We're very direct and clear. We're not going to hide anything. We think this is the best money you'll ever spend, but that's something you have to decide. And then last would be to open to questions. Well, in this meeting, when they grabbed the microphone away from me, we completely flipped it. We did the questions first. I didn't even get to the presentation until the end, and then it was very truncated, because that drama had been so dramatic with all these people standing up and they're chanting and grabbing the mic that it was almost impossible to go back to what we were going to do, given that everyone in the audience was sort of taken aback by this theater that was happening around them. So we flipped it. We started with questions and started with this group and their questions, which, as I mentioned, we at least had a path forward, and then did a shorter presentation at the end. So I definitely will make changes with an audience, depending on what I feel and see getting in the room. And the more presentations you give, the better sense that you can do that. It's almost like if you practice your sport often enough, you can improvise better because you really have the fundamentals down. Let's see. So I hope that was an answer to your question. Chelsea, I see you just popped on. So I
Yeah,
think that's
I
my
love
cue.
that question from Laura because, and I was going to say the exact thing you said at the end, sometimes the vibe in the room is very different and you have to change, but you don't have that confidence if you haven't kept practicing. So George, I want to thank you for not gatekeeping this stuff. I was thinking that as you were going along through. Originally, I had planned to summarize, but I was like, no, they can get this summary when they sign up for Convergence or when they contact you on LinkedIn. But I did take a couple notes that I wanted to call out that really stuck out to me. And one of them was you were talking about when presentation skills look easy. And something I always love to say is that people think because they can talk, they can communicate. And that's not necessarily true, right? There's strategy to all of this. And I hope people recognize too the strategy behind connecting and networking and all of that. It doesn't mean you're disingenuous. It just means you do know how human connection works. And so I love that you touched on some of that. And the last thing I think is really big that I took away, I think when people signed on to hear about persuasion, they were thinking, including myself, I'm going to hear about what I should do, how I should talk, what I should say. But really, the biggest thing we heard is that persuasion starts with listening and being open to being persuaded yourself. So thank you so much for reminding us of that. And I guess, yeah, since I did hop on and interrupt you, any last things you want to say before I?
Let's say one thing, and genuinely, the most important investments we made at DC Water, among all the investments in the thermal hydrolysis, was in our external affairs office. it doesn't matter how good you are at something if people don't know it. And if you're not communicating in a way that they understand, that someone knows and has a sense of, and the finger on the audience. And it doesn't have to, we ended up with a very pretty big external, but the board approved all those, not all at once. We would hire a person, they would see the advantage, they would approve the next hire. So over time, we built this group. And our engineers were very skeptical at first. Like, why are you hiring all these external affairs? I think of Len Benson, who was our 46-year chief engineer. Fantastic. He was so skeptical at first. At the end, when I was leaving, he came to me and said, I just wanted to tell you, I am just completely persuaded. I'm not sure he used that word, but he said that you did the right thing. That because we told our story in Washington, D.C., we got support to do things we never thought we would get support for. We always had the engineering. That was not the missing link. The missing link was having a thoughtful, prepared, professional approach to presenting our case. And that's, Chelsea, what you train at Convergence. And like I said, the most important funds and investments we made at DC Water, among many, was on that topic. Because when we did that, it unlocked everything else.
Well, thank you so much, George. Super appreciate having you on. You've got some accolades in the chat, which I'm sure will keep coming. As Allie brings up our last slide, I love that George said that, because I wish the water sector would understand this more and the need to invest in that resource, right? And that's exactly what Convergence is going to do for you. So if you have team members who you want to have these skills, if you yourself want to figure out how to have these skills, Convergence there for you. We'll put the link in the chat. You'll get an email to sign up. But if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to preview for you. Georgia was our master teacher today. The next one's coming up are some really good ones, and we have it lined out for several months after that, as well as we're leaving some space open. So when we get this cohort established and finalized, we want you guys to tell us what the need is, what experts you want us to bring in. So next month on December 10th, we have Chrissy Hirosky. She is founder and CEO of HCB Strategies, previously chief of staff at the New Orleans Sewerage and Water Board, previously Value Water Campaign Director at U.S. Water Alliance. And she's really going to talk to us about finding your voice in public conversations. I myself am excited for that one. We have Amira Palacios, who's formerly HCR, now with STV, talking about what do you do when, just like George said in his story, you show up to a meeting and there's this misaligned messaging because these people are fighting against you. And really, like George said, I'm sure part of hers will be about listening to, hey, actually, I want to hire people just like you. Like, I actually agree with you. So how do we turn those adversaries to allies? Mike McGill, Water PIO, Rebuilding Lost Trust, big expert on that. And then Georgia Gonzalez, if you do not follow Northeast Ohio Sewer District on Twitter, they're very known for that. They're very known for their voice. And so he's going to tell us like how to have a little bit more fun and do this storytelling with intention, with imagination to connect with people. So thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, George. Thank you, Sarah. There will be a survey after this, and I forgot what I'm supposed to say about it, but we would like, to improve this stuff for you and give you guys webinars and access to these leaders that you want. So hope you fill that out. You guys have a great rest of your day.